This turns everything we thought we knew about prehistory upside down. The true identity of the Akayans who attacked Troy in the Trojan War has just been identified. They were ancestors to the Vikings, Bronze Age Scandinavians. And in fact, the name Akaya lives on to the day of today in the province of Göinge in Scania in southernmost Sweden. This is a monograph that just came out, and it represents many years of research into this topic. It's the first in a series, because once the Akayans have been identified and Mycenae, the real Mycenae of Agamemnon, has been identified, a plethora of new information opens up. This is like opening up a room full of secrets that have been hidden for millennia. And well, I'm writing on the following up story, book number 2, and probably there will be more because there is so much information about this. The next one will be called Finding Argos. But I will try not to get into things that are not in this book. But let's get into this. So who am I? I'm Dr. Ulf Erlingsson, physical geographer. I wrote my thesis about the development of the physical geography of southern Sweden since the Ice Age. And that is why this material matches so well. Because when I started to take an interest in the prehistory, not just of nature, but of people who lived here, you know, history here doesn't go back more than about the Viking Age and a little bit more. And I was wondering, well, what about the other 10,000 years since the ice melted away? And that is what I now have discovered. Not because I was looking for this particular topic that it would be related to Homeros, but because I stumbled on it. Now let me tell you a little bit about this, what's in this book. It's about 170 pages, so obviously I can't get into everything. A lot of it is maps. Let me see if I can hold it up to show you. There are maps and illustrations. And it starts with going through the reason why it's necessary to re-evaluate the city of Mycenae, or the site, the location of Mycenae. Because while Troy has been correctly identified since the 1800s by Schliemann, and he correctly identified it as Troy II, that was destroyed more than 1,000 years earlier than what scholars today claim was the Trojan War. And that is why they can't make sense of the information, because they're looking at a completely wrong point of time. It was not the end of the Bronze Age. It was in fact the beginning of the Bronze Age. And that's why the outside of the book has this image of a Bronze Age ship from Sweden. These were likely illustrations of participants in the Trojan War, left in rock in Bohuslän, Sweden. So once that's been determined that the timing was the first sacking of Troy, not the second, then the next point to do was to try to find some culture in Europe where they could have come from. Some place in Europe where the description of the Akayans matches the archaeological cultures that the archaeologists have managed to deduce through years of painstaking study and survey. And once that was done, then the next task, because when I did that, I realized that my conclusion was that the Akayans were the battle axe culture. But here in Sweden, the battle axe culture did not dominate totally as on the continent. they came in as like a little thread. They came in as the upper class, the rulers. It didn't change the genetic composition in Scandinavia, more than partly. So the other cultures that continue, the pitted ware culture, so, and then we got the Bellbeaker culture. In the 3rd millennium BC, there were 4 different archaeological cultures coexisting in southern Scandinavia. And between these 4, we have all the necessary elements for the description of the Akayans in the Trojan War. So once, and they melted together right about a century or so before the Trojan War. It's perfect. I mean, I take my hat off for the archaeologists. And so then, once I had determined the time and the place where these Akayans lived, the next task was to try to prove it by finding them on the map. So obviously, the landscape has changed. Well, maybe you don't know that there is a lot of land uplift in Sweden, in Scandinavia. Not so much in Denmark, but in Sweden mostly. Which means that the map in the Bronze Age was not the same as today. So when people in the past, like Felice Vinci, have been looking for this, they've been looking at the wrong map, I think. He identified an island in Denmark, Lye, as Ithaca. I went there and I saw immediately that that's impossible. That hasn't changed much, but because the Lye doesn't match the description in the Odyssey and Iliad. It has to be the last island to the west, which Greek Ithaca is not. And there are some other, it has to be slippery in the fall when they came back. Is not suitable for horses, rather poor. So, looking at the map, I determined that there is like one possible place in Norway and one possible place in Sweden and no possible place in Denmark for this. And the possible place in Sweden was Tjörn, but it's just one island. So, going back to this time, Troy 2, which is 2300 to 2250 BC is the date of it. That places us in Neolithicum in Scandinavia, the end of Neolithicum, before what they call Bronze Age here. But they had bronze. It's just that the bronze was limited to the upper class, to the battle axe culture, to the elite. And that's why the archaeologists who base their description on what the majority have, or their classification, they said, oh, that's not the Bronze Age. But they did have bronze, and indeed they even had iron, according to Homeros. But you must not be confused by this classification system in Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. That's an artificial classification system that cannot be used backwards, so to say. And in fact, the origin of that classification system is a place that will play an important role in the next book. So I won't get ahead of me there. So anyway, having identified a likely candidate in Tjörn on the Swedish west coast in Bohuslän, I proceeded. This was 25 years ago when digital data was still prohibitively expensive. So I digitized the topographic map at the level approximately where the shoreline had been back then. It had been between 10 and 15 meters higher than today. So I digitized the 15-meter curve and discovered that back then Tjörn was 3 distinct islands. And then the one closest to the west, southwest, was obviously the original Tjörn. And in the lowermost point towards the sea, there is a headland that's called Tjörnehuvud, well visible, and it's a landmark for sailors passing there. And that I identified as Korakos, because nearby, Korakos Petre, the Raven Rock. There are ravens. If you go there, you will hear them. Nearby, there is a little bay, a little harbor called Kårevik. So the name Kåre is preserved locally. And then, as a nice surprise, I discovered that there is a place called Ulsby nearby. And as you know, the other name of Odysseus is Ulysses. And there is a place called Ulsby Slott. The castle of Ulsby, of Ulysses' village. Now, this sounds too good to be true, too easy. So I spent over 20 years researching and going through before publishing this, after having identified it. Because I did not want to publish it until having the whole map laid out. And that is in this book. There are approximately 200 toponyms mapped out in Scandinavia in this book. Let's say, just as an example, I started in the same order as Homeros, except I left the first few to the end. And I tell you why right now. Because the very first places he mentions are way up in the mountains. They are in Jämtland, in Oviksfjällen. What were they doing in Oviksfjällen? Where the Sami live, reindeer herders. Think about it. Well, one of the things we find up there is Handel, where they have a very good source of what in Sweden is called täljsten, soapstone. And from soapstone, you can make all kinds of useful implements. Pot, in Norwegian, is called pot stone, because you make pots from them. You don't need ceramics when you have soapstone in your landscape. You just go out and carve out with a hard piece of rock. You carve out the thing you need. So why don't we find a lot of soapstone things in the archaeological archive? Because it can be reused. If the pot breaks, you can take the parts and make other implements. And you can use it to make molds for casting metal, like gold, because they had gold. When the land melted out from the ice, there was a lot of gold sieved out by the glaciifluvial rivers. So they could just pick up gold and use it, and they could. It has a rather low melting point, so it's not that hard to melt it, and you could cast it in one of those molds, or you could hammer it. They had a good life, but they left almost nothing to the geological archive, because the soapstone, once you have used it to smaller and smaller pieces, eventually it just turns into the dirt on the floor of your house. If you don't have separate floor, which they didn't, they had just earth floor. And that's why there is nothing left of it. They didn't need ceramics. The reason they didn't do ceramics is because they didn't need it. They were provisioned by nature. So starting up in the high mountains, close to the Norwegian border, and then the list goes down to the coast. Homeros lists 29, if I'm not mistaken, contingents in the Trojan War from the Akayans. And the first one, the Boiotians, is the biggest one. They have, I think, 29 toponyms. I may be mistaking the number here, but it's something like that. And here is a curious thing. They were all from what we call Norrland. We here in the south of Sweden, we call that Norrland. And the biggest contingent was from Norrland. Now, people in Norrland today, 2026 AD, complain that we in the south call them Norrland as one big thing, when in reality is divided in different landscape, like Härjedalen, Jämtland, Ångermanland, etc. And Homeros did the same. because when you read the list in the catalog of ships in the Iliad, he has 4 different commanders from Boeotia. And when I map them out on the map, they coincide with 4 different landscapes in Norland. So today, there's been 4,200 plus years that have passed, but we here still view them as Norland, although it was called Boeotia back then. And Boeotia lives on in Botten, as Västerbotten, because West Bothnia, because Sweden later got East Bothnia and what is now Finland, and it was West Bothnia was split into North Bothnia. But Bothnia is from the Stone Age. The name is from the Stone Age. And they'd been there a long time before the Trojan War. So once these have been identified, we can start to read Greek mythology with a completely different set of glasses. Because Heracles, the hero, look at the landscape symbol for Norrbotten. It's him. He is an old hero from Scandinavia. So this has deep roots. But again, I don't want to get ahead of myself. This book is just about the mapping of the contingents of the Trojan War, identifying who they were. The history will come in future books. So, well, the book is available for ordering online. Finding Akaya, or Who Sacked Troy and When. I will leave a link in the description. And, well, I think with this, I made a sufficient introduction for you to see that this is a revolutionary, this is a paradigm shift for how we view prehistory. In the following books, I will write the history of Scania, Scandinavia. Again, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but the very name, Scandinavia, I also have the reason for that, the etymology of it, that will come in a future book. It's absolutely mind-boggling. This turns everything we thought we knew about prehistory upside down. I cannot overstate what a big change this is. And I understand that people who see this on YouTube think, oh, this is clickbait, this can't be true, and they don't click it. And I can see that because when I put out a video saying that breaking news, this is like this and so, nobody clicks it almost because they don't believe it can be true. And that's what happens often when you have something that's absolutely revolutionary, people just don't believe it. So I fully expect that these videos will get flatlined and with almost no views for a long, long time, because nobody can take this in almost. But I'm also putting the information out there to scientists, so hopefully eventually some scholar will take notice, because this affects a lot of scientific topics. A lot. Also, I found proof that my theory that I presented in my doctoral dissertation in 1990 was true. So, this kind of confirms that I was right about my book about Atlantis in 2004. It's all coming together. And to me, it's kind of hilarious that people are ignoring it because it's too disruptive. But with that, I sign off. And, well, see you next time.